Hi there, I'm Ted Price from Insomniac Games, and on today's episode of The Game Maker's Notebook, I had the pleasure of speaking with an industry legend, Amy Hennig. We covered a variety of topics, including the marriage of narrative and design, creative leadership, and how development culture is evolving.
Welcome to The Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. This is fun. We've been talking about this for a long time.
We have.
You had to trap me at DICE to be able to finally get me to do this.
Well, you were very popular. And I think it's been great to hear sort of your experiences talking to other people. And you mentioned that you're talking a lot. So
yes, I know. So I should say my husky voice is just because of all the talking over crowds yesterday. So
is that something you like doing?
DICE voice.
Do you like talking to crowds? Do you like doing interviews?
Well, I mean, gosh, I don't know. You just flip a switch and kind of get yourself into that mode, right?
Yeah.
Like it's most of us are introverts. And so, you spend a day doing this and then you kind of go to your hotel room and curl into a ball and shake a little bit because it's like, you've been having to be an extrovert all day.
Well, that's true. I think there is this social overload thing that happens.
Sure. Look, I'll put it this way. It's way easier to go sit on a stage and do a presentation or a chat than it is just to talk to people one-on-one at a party or a sort of one-on-one interview. It's just a different relationship, I guess. But yes, it's I think being on all day and trying to be articulate and it can be exhausting.
But that in some ways is similar to what we do in development too, right? Because if you're a creative director, you are the person who generally is making a lot of comments, has has answers that people want to hear.
Yeah, but I think the difference is I could happily talk about work or craft in front of a crowd of 5,000 people or to a room of developers or whatever. It's the small talk aspect of trying to figure out, well, what do we talk about? Again, we're all on the spectrum a little bit, right? Yeah. And so trying to figure out how we actually interact like human beings, it's much easier. So yeah, talking to people all day as a creative director, that's relatively easy because you're talking about objective things, right? It's just the socializing part of it that I think is sort of a little alien and exhausting.
Do you find that within development teams there's enough socialization? And I don't know what enough really means, but is it necessary?
I mean, just for people actually to socialize?
Yeah, to get to know each other versus just let's talk about craft and let's figure out what we're actually making.
Yeah, well, look, I think the line's probably pretty blurry, right? Even when it's not a presentational environment when you're trying to solve a problem or work through an idea together. There's a social aspect even to that, right?
Yeah.
Because it's collaborative. It's not like the director saying, here, I'm going to dictate to you. But yeah, look, I mean, there's been situations, especially with large teams, where if there's not enough reasons for people to just sort of socially interact, it can, in larger organizations, lead to a little bit of kind of like us and theming, you know? So I think it's really important once you pass that 100-person mark to make sure that there's reasons for people to cross-pollinate and meet and just sort of hang out.
That makes sense. I mean, I think that's something that's easy to forget. In fact, we probably don't talk about it enough in this industry about how to foster team dynamics for different types of teams. How do you do that? What are the kind of things that we should encourage as far as making those more difficult conversations easier? Because the difficult conversations about features and what works and what doesn't always come up, right? Yeah,
you mean how to make it easier if you're actually having sort of a social exchange or social relationship anyway? Or do you mean just how do we get better as communicators?
Probably better as communicators so that we don't feel uncomfortable talking honestly with each other. I mean, well, maybe let me ask you, is that do you think it's necessary to be socially connected to be able to be more honest, or is it easier to say not?
Sometimes it's not easier. I mean, sometimes it's easier because there's nothing to muddy muddy it up. It's clearly just about work and craft, right? I generally haven't had those problems, though, because, I mean, you become friends with people you work with.
Yeah.
And that you also have to give them direction and correction and stuff like that. Look, I mean, I think the main thing in terms of teaching people about communication, it's pretty simple, is that, and I think this is actually something from Creativity Inc., if I'm remembering right, but like that you have to treat the things that you're hashing out as objective problems that are being solved. I think he describes it as, surgeons standing around a patient on the table, right? Well, you're talking objectively about the patient. If it's a battle of wills, or that people are being, sensitive, or sort of like, holding back, like the patient's gonna die, right? Like, so any more than surgeons should, have all those sort of complicated emotional dynamics, neither should we, right? And so what I found, even when I've tried to coach young leads or young directors, is that sometimes they have trouble giving feedback, and they can't figure out why they're getting a bad response. It's because as humans, we're uncomfortable critiquing other people. We're afraid of conflict, and we're afraid of saying something negative. But it's worse when you kind of tiptoe around something, because then people are immediately defensive, right? But if you just sort of walk up to them and you have to give them feedback, but you're talking objectively about the problem that you're trying to solve, and it's not a criticism of them, it's a critique of the thing, right? And it immediately diffuses or disarms any of that tendency on their part to be defensive, I think. And that is the number one lesson I've seen people need to learn, is that they need to sort of remove some of that kind of kind of pussyfooting around, or kind of trying to sort of couch feedback a certain way, because it's like, well, now you've already pissed them off.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, is there a specific approach that you espouse when you are coaching new leads in terms of giving negative feedback? Let's pretend I have just given you a level design.
Right.
And you think it sucks.
Right. Well, the thing that... I'm not role playing very well, am I? The thing, look, I've had to do that a lot, and one thing is that again, it's human nature for people who are receiving negative feedback or critical feedback to kind of tense up and get defensive. Mm-hmm. But the worst thing that we can do, and as other human beings, we can feel that. We could feel them getting angry or getting frustrated, right? But actually engaging on that level actually is going to make that worse. I think the better thing to do is to sort of plow forward and be able to walk through kind of empathetically, if we're talking about layout, for instance. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the player, right, all the time. And sometimes, I'm going off on a design tangent because I'm inclined to do that, but we get into this sort of God's eye view problem with layout and game design sometimes, where, it makes so much sense to us, and we're also looking at it sort of from 1,000 feet away. And we forget to actually step into the player's shoes and go, okay, well, what do they know right now? What do they think? What are they feeling? What do they think their goal is? What do they think their obstacles are, right? And so when you're tackling something that you're trying to solve that way, which is literally trying to wrestle with the objective facts of the thing, I guess there's just not that much there for people to take offense to. I mean, I think sometimes we as directors, we have to do that, and then we walk away and they probably go, that asshole, right? And that's fine. I mean, let them vent, right? But you don't want that to be the tenor of the conversation. And as long as it doesn't feel like you're criticizing them or disappointed in them or mad at them, it's more like you're trying to wrestle through the problems in front of you, then I think that's somewhat diffusing. The other aspect, I think, is just making sure that we're good at being on the receiving end of that. Yeah. That we're able to receive critical feedback from the people we work with. That we also expose our own uncertainty about things. And, I try to do, it's maybe frustrating to some people, I don't know, but I try to do a lot of verbal processing, because I'm sure you've been in this position too. Like when somebody shows you something, they want feedback right now, right? It's exhausting to be on all the time and shift gears, to be able to go, okay, I was just looking at, a mechanics question, and now I'm looking at layout, or now I'm looking at art, or now I'm looking at an edit of a cinematic. You need to be able to shift gears fast. And then it's sometimes you need a little time to like take in what you're seeing, but that silence when you're just absorbing and thinking can be deadly.
Yeah.
Because they're going to spin out and maybe think the worst. It's like, well, she doesn't like it, right? So I've sort of started verbally processing, and, you know, you want to make sure you don't confuse people with that because you're going on a little verbal journey, a little, you know, vocally kind of working through your thoughts. But I think, it helps humanize us as directors to go, okay, well, I don't necessarily immediately know the answer to this question. Let's walk it through, right? And then arrive at a conclusion, right? You don't want to leave indecisive, but like, you know, let's arrive at a conclusion together. So I feel like it makes it more of a collaborative thing. It exposes the fact that, you know, we're not being all-knowing or arbitrary either, right? And that I think that we expose the things that are on our plates to the same sort of like scrutiny. Like, do people like the scene that got written? You know, what do people think about this idea? Not that you're going to democratize, right? But the point that you should be as open to feedback as you're requiring them to be.
I think that's fantastic advice for any creative director or lead. And it sort of reflects to me what we experience in usability feedback. When you have a player who's actually expressing their raw thoughts as they're playing through a level or using a game mechanic for the first time.
That's the most helpful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't want them to be silent.
Right.
And you're trying to interpret their silence. Are they engaged?
Yeah.
Are they frustrated? Right. And we do some of that when we're looking through the glass, right? We can see if people are leaning in or dropping their controller or like, you know, dropping their shoulders. But the best thing is when you can sit down with somebody and have them verbalize what it is that they're thinking in each moment.
Yeah. Well, I think as a director, that's to me, that's unique. I think that's a great technique that everybody should try.
Yeah. No, for sure. Absolutely. That's we've done some of that. We often did that kind of sort of ad hoc with each other. Like, you know, you'll grab somebody and say, play my level, right?
Yeah.
But we should do it more with the people that we're, you know, focus testing with.
Do you believe the tendency for most directors in your experience is to, if you're reviewing something, to grab it and go off into a room by oneself, play it, write down a whole bunch of stuff, and then come back with an avalanche of feedback? Is that what you see more, or do you see what you're discussing more, which is the, hey, let's go through this together. Let me take the time.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's complicated, right? And like, you know, the narrowest of lines between doing it well and doing it badly, right?
I think both work, frankly. I mean, it just depends on what you prepare people for, right?
I think so. And look, both are probably necessary at different points, because that feeling of having to be, I mean, and look, this is our job. You have to be present. You have to be like taking all this information in and be ready to give feedback. The bad version of that is, you know, people who sort of take the adage that, you know, any decision is better than no decision, right? That sometimes I think people abdicate the responsibility to have a good answer, and they think that it's okay as a director to be sort of arbitrary, you know? Because I think we need to be able to defend our decisions, right, and our positions on things. Not that, again, that we're trying to democratize a decision, but I think that it lets other people into the process to understand if you're saying, no, let's, you know, why are you saying blue instead of green? It's like, well, I could just say, because I said blue, right? That's my job. Your job is to make it blue. Well, that'd be pretty dick move, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you get to that point, right, where you go, because I said so, right? You know, I got so many things to do, I can't debate it anymore. But mostly you want to walk through and say, and that's the other way of giving objective feedback, right, is the fact that you're going like, okay, I see why you like that. I understand where you're trying to go with that. Here's the thing. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. And it actually doesn't solve the right problem, or it's diverting us from the problem we need to solve. So, you know, I'm not arbitrarily saying blue instead of green. I'm saying blue because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Right. So that certainly, you would hope, empowers them then to go, well, maybe the next decision I have to make, I'll have that context, right? Our goal should always be to try to empower people to go, I can fill in the blanks. I don't need to ask every, you know, permission for every decision I'm making. And our goal as directors is to be able to like go, I mean, I've always described it as you have to have enough ego to be able to kind of hold the line on the stuff that holds the thing together, right? So it has a sort of a cohesive shape, but be humble enough to go, other people are going to have better ideas than you. And just because they did something different than what you were envisioning or what you asked for even maybe, if it's better, then you go, holy shit, that's amazing, thank you, right? Let's do that. and stuff any of your own petty feelings down about, well, that wasn't my idea, right? And we also have to have enough humility to go, if somebody comes up with something, a solution to a problem or a design or whatever, that's different than I would have gone or I intended, but it's just as good and it does the job, then that wins. Their idea wins. And, we often get this wrong, and I will cop to that as much as anybody, but the goal is to make sure that people really are empowered because they understand, the principles, the pillars of the thing that you're trying to make, so they can make those sort of decisions themselves. If they go, well, if somebody comes to them or if they have an idea, but then they can kind of check it against, the core pillars that you've established, then they're going to make something that is the shape of the thing you're trying to make. And it might even surprise you. Ideally, that's what you want, right? What we do is improv, right? Basically, right? We should be.
I've never heard it described that way, but yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Well, what's been fascinating for me, I've completely gone off on a tangent from your question now, but the microcosm of working with actors on the stage, and I'm sure you visited the stage lots of times, right? You must have.
Early on.
Yeah, but not lately?
No. Right at this point, it has been our creative directors and writers and animation directors who go down to the stage. I mean, part of...
Do you visit, though?
I actually don't.
Oh, okay.
No, because part of it is they're empowered to make the calls. And that creative delegation has been really important for us to succeed with larger teams.
Oh, yeah, totally, for sure. I just more meant in terms of, seeing what I'm about to describe, which is the fact that...
So I had the pleasure of being a creative director on our projects way back, but I've had to step out of that role.
Sure, yeah, other people's job now, right? But so what we do on the stage is a microcosm of what we're doing back at the studio, right? Yeah. Which is, you've prepared some work, you've got some scenes that you want to shoot, some moves that you need to capture, and then you have hired and cast other professionals, actors and stunt people that are now your collaborators, right? And you bring them into the process. And ideally what we would do then is go, okay, so here's what we're thinking. Let's make it better, right?
Yeah.
So even with the scenes, the first day is sit down at the table and there's a bunch of pencils and here's the scripts. Let's tear it up and make it better, right? And they put in their own thoughts on the thing. So we're yes-ending each other there in terms of improv, right? And then we get out on the stage, when we're blocking it and thinking about it, the actors know they're free to go, well, what if we gave her that line and then I was over here, and you go, oh yeah, absolutely, that's so much better. Yes, awesome. Do that, right? And again, that constant balance between, because half the idea somebody throws at you, you're like, I see why you like that, but it breaks this, and this, that you have to say no to. But again, instead of just a sort of blank no, if you can explain it, to go, unfortunately it breaks this and this.
Yeah.
But you have to, in the moment, and this is much more immediate, you have to be in the moment to be able to go, yes, let's do that. That's okay. And actually, because of the way we write these things, sort of a scene at a time out of sequence, right? With everything changing underfoot in the game design, you're also holistically casting out at everything that you've already written, everything you're going to write, and go, okay, well, if we change this today, does that work with what we already shot? Does it change what we're going to shoot? Is that okay? And then you just sort of go, yeah, cool, yes. And then you make a bunch of mental notes about how that choice ripples, right? And you're making something there on the day. You can't bog down. You can't let your actors shut down and think that you're just being a dictator with them. You've got to make your day. You can't bog down and start debating a thing. You have to be decisive and quick, but inclusive, right? And flexible. That's just a miniature version of what we should be doing in the studio all the time. So when you talk about what's the best way to give feedback, look, there's plenty of times when we all do this where you sit down with a game and you need to just sort of marinate in it a little bit. Maybe stop, take a note, kind of work your way through, because you also don't want to give people such off-the-cuff feedback that you go, with a little bit more time, I might have given a more nuanced answer or even a different answer, right? So sometimes, I'll sit down with the game and I'll just make a whole bunch of notes. Or what I'll do is I'll play it and just sort of verbally barf out all of my notes and somebody writes them down. That's a little bit more efficient than stopping and writing. But ideally, I like to try to do it live, right? And the people that I've been able to do that with, were generally grateful. They knew, even though it took a little bit more time, and it was both of us burning our time to do that, rather than me going, I'll go off and make some notes so you can keep working, and then I'll just deliver you a document. It's just a little cold, you know?
You know what? That's a great perspective. And it is, I agree with you. It is worth making the time to sit down with a particular team or person who really is interested in your feedback. Mm-hmm. And I also find that the written word often can convey the wrong tone, depending on how somebody interprets it, right?
Right. And we want to be as succinct as possible, but then you just worry. It's almost like you want to put smileys next to things like, you know, it's like the reason we do in text is like, this could be misinterpreted. And if people are already inclined to be sensitive about their work, because that's human nature, then it's even colder if it just ends up in a JIRA or something like that, right?
Right.
And so what I found, especially, you know, working with young designers and stuff, is that they seem to appreciate that dialogue and the time, and that it actually is an investment. So if on paper you might go, well, right now it's, you know, so we're both burning these hours instead of one of us being productive in some other way. But what you've actually done is actually empowered that person to then emulate that feedback while they're working, meaning like proactively, preemptively, right? Because now they know the process and how you think and kind of what your feedback is going to be on a thing, right?
Yep.
You're empowering them.
Has your approach changed? I mean, because I think what you're describing is a really mature, seasoned approach that's born out of many years of production. Yeah. When you started, say, on Legacy of Kain, one of your first games, did you approach things the same way?
Man, it's hard to remember. Sometimes it's a long time ago. It's going to be 20 years this year since Soul River.
All right.
1999. I think I've gotten better at it. Look, there's something that also happens as you get older, which is you also you stop second guessing yourself as much, and you sort of you don't care what other people think, which actually ends up leaning into, I think, this whole idea of just be candid and honest and verbalize things, and other people will receive that well, right? I'm not saying you should just be, have no filter and just insult people. I don't mean that. What I mean is that it's when we're young, and I think Brian talked about some of this when you were talking yesterday, you worry about, I find a lot of, I'm going off on all these tangents, but I find a lot of young designers will, or even first-time leads or first-time directors, they think the job is to be authoritative, right? And so somebody who, as a non-lead, was a good communicator and seemed thoughtful and empathetic to people, all of a sudden can become kind of a dick. And it's because they're actually trying to take on the mantle of the job. I'm supposed to be decisive. I'm supposed to tell people what to do. And it seems like weakness to kind of externalize your thoughts and go, I don't know. Let me think about that, But I think part of it with age and experience, you get to the point where it's I don't care if somebody thinks something ill of me because I don't have an immediate answer and I'm verbalizing my way to it. That's fine. That's on them, right? So I think I've always been pretty okay at it. I mean, look, we all have good days and bad days. I've good weeks and bad months, whatever, where you're doing your job well and when you're not. But I think when I was doing my job well, even back in those early days at Crystal, I think because some of my advice to these, what I'm describing about how to be objective, how to give objective advice and not personalize it, that goes back to then, trying to train up young leads and stuff like that. So I think I've always been pretty good about trying to articulate and frame feedback in a way that hopefully won't offend.
Yeah.
But I think I've gotten way more comfortable with the idea that I don't have to tiptoe. And actually, somebody who takes offense when I'm, externalizing objective feedback, it's not on me, that's on them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, something you just mentioned, which I think is an opportunity in the industry, is training leads. Right? Do you think in the industry this is sort of a leading question, but do we do enough to train people for leadership positions? Because you mentioned you see people going from being thoughtful and objective to feeling like they need to be authoritative because now they're in a leadership position.
Right. And so some of that is coming out of not knowing what the role really is.
Yeah.
And also just a lack of confidence. Whenever you see somebody exerting that much apparent confidence, it's usually because they're not,
Yeah.
right? Those of us, I think, and the people that I admire that seem like they're actually accomplished and can have confidence, they're relaxed, right? And so it actually has the opposite effect, right? I mean, I immediately assume when somebody's sort of like, shutting people down or not wanting to show any weakness, it's because they're desperately afraid that they're not equipped, that they're in over their head. And the thing is, I try to tell people, especially young people when I speak, it's like, we all feel that way all the time. Like, you don't ever get over that, right? And ideally you don't, because hopefully you're always sort of pushing yourself and trying to do something new and different and not just sort of like repeating the same old thing you've always done. But it's just like we are racked as creative people with self-doubt. And we're just making our best guesses too, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, there are no right answers.
Yeah,
ever.
It's the whole imposter syndrome thing, right? That people don't believe that folks that seem accomplished and like calm and relaxed and confident are suffering from it as much as anybody else, right? It's just human nature. As a matter of fact, I think the best people suffer from it. The people that seem like they don't seem like they have any sort of internal life or, actually question themselves at all, are the ones that seem, I guess they seem very overtly confident, but it's a dead giveaway that, they're not. So I think just embracing vulnerability and weakness and doing it in a way that feels like, I'm giving you feedback. I'm asking you to be vulnerable in front of me, and I'm willing to be vulnerable in front of you. And that you're not having an internal dialogue where you're trying to second guess how people are reacting to your feedback, because then that's going to give you some of this weird veneer that is going to be off. But I mean, it's just like, yes, I think we should be training people how to do this, right?
Yes, and I think what you just said.
Or just talking about it would be good.
Yeah.
Right?
Talking about techniques and just being honest with each other about how you maybe take how you want criticism. Like how should it be framed for you? I was in an argument the other day and I found myself immediately getting defensive, and it escalated because I got defensive.
Oh, and we can smell it on each other, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it puts you into that sort of alpha fighting mode.
So I think it's worse for guys, actually. I really do. A lot of these people that I've coached have been young men, because it's, again, you're giving somebody feedback and you can feel them bristling, right? Or they give you a response that is automatically defensive. But
that's interesting too. I mean, you're looking for visible cues, and when you say you feel, I mean, we all, I think, are conditioned to look for really subtle changes in people's faces, in their postures, and how much they lean in, which is fascinating to me because we do have these discussions, these difficult discussions all the time, and it is so entertaining to see the different reactions and how people react to criticism, maybe being aggressive back, being defensive, crossing arms and sort of getting small. They're really...
Oh yeah, people will like fold up and hug themselves, and I mean in an angry way sometimes, yeah.
But as a leader, what great cues they are to change how you then tailor your responses when you see those very overt signs.
Right. The last thing you want to do is go, what's your problem?
Right.
It's like, well, you have to just kind of barrel through it.
Yeah.
And like if you just stay the course and don't get defensive, even though you can feel your own hackles going up, right? Because again, we're animals, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody's bristling, you start to bristle, and then you just stuff that down because it's like, well, you can't engage like that.
Well, I like what you said about vulnerability, right? When you dissemble or when you disarm yourself and say, let's just take a deep breath. I feel like I'm getting defensive. I apologize for that.
Yeah.
And
that can be disarming, right? Because it gives everyone permission to do that.
Well, I think too, because of the positions that directors are in, right? People automatically assume that they're the authoritarian. When you can show that moment of humanity, it makes you more relatable, and you can have that more sort of level conversation.
I think so. And I think it lets them know that it's okay.
Yeah.
Right? You set the tone.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, we are wired to pick up on these cues.
Yeah.
And therefore our job is to like consciously like not respond and just keep talking. Now, granted, if somebody seems like they're really getting upset, you don't want to be, an asshole and just kind of keep, grinding them down, right? But like in general, it's just more like if you stop and go, well, you seem to have a problem with that. Well, now you're in an argument.
Right. You've escalated it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that might be harder for men than it is for women.
Yeah.
I think even picking up some of these cues might be harder for men than it is for women.
I think you're right. Well, I don't have no experience as a woman, so I don't know. But I know that as a male, I think we are conditioned to look for that response because it's probably evolutionary.
Maybe,
We are primed to go into either defensive or aggressive mode based on what we see.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so, so it can be really hard to just kind of keep going. Like you can feel your temperature kind of flushing a little bit and you're like, but you're just going to keep going because you got to get the feedback out and keep it objective. And most of the time, it just means that then like there's no purchase for them. There's nothing they can get those hooks into because you're not engaging on that level, and eventually that's
it's not becoming personal, right?
No,
I think
exactly.
That's what I like about
they just sort of they can like relax a little bit.
Yeah,
I think And again, like I said, I may think I have a fine interaction, and then walk away and have somebody go, I can't stand her. I'm sure that happens all the time, but I've done my job.
Yeah.
Right. And the other thing is I think kind of going along with what you said about expressing vulnerability is the fact that when you're giving feedback, being willing to say, I don't know, what do you think? Right? I often say, look, I'm just thinking out loud here. Like, just so they don't take my external working it through as direction necessarily. I'm trying to include them in the process. And I don't want it to be a monologue, ideally, right? So asking people what they think, saying I don't know is okay, and then trying to work through the problem. Or kind of working through it and then going like, I could be totally wrong here, but what do you all think? And
those are great tools. I think, those in particular, and asking people what they think, right? I don't know. What do you think? What a great method that is to saying it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to invite people. They assume it's going to be a one-way conversation a lot of times. And so opening that door and making it clear that it's not just, you mean it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think is really important.
Do you actively mentor folks?
Sometimes, not like any sort of formal way, I guess. But those relationships tend to sort of happen organically.
Okay.
I guess where you find that there's people that seek you out for advice, and I don't know if we would go, hey, mentor mentee, right? But have these kind of conversations about like, I had this interaction with this person and it went completely south. Why do you think that happened?
Yeah.
And then try to kind of walk them through it. Like, so yeah, I feel like
that's great.
Without having like thought about what label I'd put on it, that probably there's quite a few.
It seems to me, again, another big opportunity for our industry. If we want to get collectively better, there are a lot of folks in senior roles who could contribute quite a bit of their wisdom to these very, very important interpersonal interactions that happen in the creative sphere.
Right.
So I think it's great you do. I think everything you're saying is extremely valuable to any up and coming lead, creative director, anybody who has to lead a team, a creative team in particular.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of what Brian's journey was, right? That it's sort of he went from feeling like he had to have all the answers and be able to dictate and be able to go because I said so, right? To going, oh no, actually this I don't have to be a jerk about this. I can actually open the doors and let other people into this process and share some of the burden.
And for listeners out there, Amy's referring to Brian Intihar.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm being so casual.
No worries. Brian is the creative director on Spider-Man, and I will say that you bring that up, and I see that as a missed opportunity for me. I could have done a lot better in preparing him for that role. I often make the assumption that people who are moving into leadership roles understand the kinds of problems and solutions you have to you're going to employ, which is just dumb. Because
how would they know?
Exactly. Right. They have no way of knowing. Right. And so again, that's more just sort of a self-reminder for me to step in and say, hey, you know what? You're going to run into this issue. Right. And when you do, let's either talk about it or maybe here's some tools you can use.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it sounds like he did all the right things, which is just to go, guys, I need feedback. Let me know what I can do better. And
absolutely. Yeah. Brian is a natural leader.
Yeah, exactly.
And that worked out really well.
Yeah.
And so it's great. What I love about this conversation in particular, Amy, is that we dove right into it. And these are the kind of topics that I love discussing because they're all about culture and they're all about how the cultural underpinnings of a team and the interaction can end up creating greatness.
Right.
So what were some of the memorable moments for you on, say, Uncharted, where you had sort of the go, no go sort of decisions to make that could have taken the game completely off a cliff or ended up taking it into where it is now?
Oh man, it's hard to come up with these things off the cuff. Well, look, some of the things that come to mind immediately, speak to that idea of openness, of going like, not assuming that the best ideas are going to come from you. They could come from anybody, and then it's additive. It's not sort of saying, okay, so it's going to be their idea. It's like, okay, well, they springboarded off of something I said, and then they came up with an idea, and then I plus one to that, I plus that in some way. And just understanding that is the process, which is why I kind of hate when we sort of talk about, we try to assign kind of, authorship or something like that. Because as we know, any game or anything that you make, I mean, maybe there is some aspect that, somebody in our position infuses our own personality or whatever, our vibe into the thing. But in general, it is this sort of wild organic thing made out of so many people's impulses and ideas that, like, characterizing it as any one person's creation is just like ridiculous, right? So the things I think of is when, like, I mean, obviously I'm just randomly here, like I remember on Uncharted 1 for a long time we were kind of in the mode of not wanting, we weren't going to make a shooter, right? We spent a lot of time trying to use, like, auto lock on, auto aiming, figuring out how to make that stylish and just sort of simple. And then just kind of had the oh duh moment a while in, kind of like, why aren't we just actually embracing the fact that this could be a really good analog shooter? And that changed the DNA of the entire process. And I don't even remember where that came from. It might have been Bruce, it might have been Evan, it might have just been collectively that we were all, it was in the zeitgeist of where we were moving because we weren't happy with how we were solving that problem. I mean, even just the structure of Uncharted 2, the fact that, starting it from that flash forward and stuff like that was partly us collectively trying to solve a problem of the opening would have been, if we just started in the museum in Uncharted 2, it would have been too much of sort of a slow runway. And so I think we had seen like Mission Impossible 3, and they start with that very shocking, flash forward, and we thought, right? I mean, that got it into our brains, and then and we wanted to start in the snow, and then I don't remember, we came up with this idea of like, well, why don't we just start after the train crash and it'd be like the biggest, WTF? Because we actually put that in like macros and stuff. What's our WTF moment here?
Which was a fantastic start. I mean, it really sucks you right into the game.
Yeah. No, and the thing is funny how it came from all these different inspirations, in terms of just pace, and then also just structurally realizing that, we needed it narratively, and we liked the fact that it would raise all these questions, but it didn't sort of like pop in as sort of one formed thought, right? I would say, again, kind of going back to working with actors and kind of what they improvisationally do, like it'll change the course of a story and the nature of the character, and we have to be open to that, not trying to like cram them into a box that we've already defined for them.
I want to go back to the gun moment, though.
Yeah.
When you made the decision to incorporate guns into the gameplay, were there people who were saying, no?
Well, there were always guns. It was just a question of whether it was going to be a shooter per se.
Okay. Well,
right?
Actually, that's an interesting label, right? What really does make a shooter? I mean, you've got melee combat.
I think it's the analog.
Melee.
It's the analog nature of the controls, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, which is why we go back to that well over and over again. I mean, as human beings, we liked to hurl things at other things, right? I mean, we are wired to do that. But it is just a natural. So much. The best mechanics are analog in nature rather than just sort of button presses, right? And that's why we keep going back to the gunplay or aiming.
Well, yeah. Speaking of that,
because they're analog. I mean, there's skill involved in finding your target.
So prior to this is something I don't know, and maybe a lot of our listeners don't know either. Prior to that, did you have you could press a button, but there was no aiming for the shooting in the game?
Right. So it was going to be kind of like auto lock. We tried a bunch of stuff, if I recall correctly. First, we were just going to kind of go, okay, well, it's as shooting is as important to the game as it is to an Indiana Jones movie. He doesn't do it very often, right? So if you don't want to turn it into a core mechanic, then you want sort of the stylish, gunplay events, but without making it like a full-on sort of like literal analog shooter, right? And so we were auto-locking onto targets. Then I think we were trying to say, well, maybe that didn't work very well. We'll do some sort of influence targeting where we can kind of like snap to, like we just talked through and tried a bunch of stuff. And then finally just went, what are we doing? Why aren't we just actually making this an analog shooter? Now, like I said, it completely changed the DNA of the game. We never would have had a multiplayer like we had, I mean, some could say, and I might be one of them, it became too much of a shooter, right? Because we got all these comments about sort of the ludonarrative dissonance of the charming hapless adventurer who kills 1,000 guys, right?
You said ludonarrative dissonance? Ludonarrative
you have
dissonance.
not heard that for the first time just now.
I just heard that for the first time.
Where have you been? Under what rock have you been? So cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
But so I feel like, who came up with that word?
Ludo
it was
games,
Clint
right?
Hawking, I think.
Okay.
I'd be in big trouble if I got that wrong. But yes, Ludo is games, narrative is narrative, right? And so the idea that the story and the gameplay are sort of colliding in a way that creates a dissonant effect. So it's like cognitive dissonance, but it's the collision of the disconnect in the game and the gameplay and the story. And so this is it. I mean, the fact that he seems like he's always on his heels and he's kind of vulnerable. I mean, he's good at this, but like not totally good at it. Same as Indiana Jones, right? Like he's kind of always at the limit of his ability, right? But then, and he's quippy, right? And over the course of the game, you might shoot like 900 or 1,000 guys, right? So you're like squaring the idea of this sort of charming adventurer with this mass serial murderer is pretty tough, right?
Yeah.
That's ludonarrative dissonance. And at a certain point, you have to just kind of throw your hands up and go, it's a game. Like, games are about, like, learning mechanics and complicating them and mastering them, right? Like, you don't do that and shoot the gun 3 times, right? So, sort of like we always said, treat the combat as a metaphor. Like, imagine it's as frequent or, as few guys as if it was in an Indiana Jones film. Cut us some slack because we're trying to make a game. But the closer we get, it's an uncanny valley of gameplay, right? The closer we get to believable characters and these believable stories, we do have a responsibility to figure out when we're just sort of like breaking them with the gameplay, right? Or vice versa. So,
well, that is a wonderful sort of opportunity to talk about design plus narrative, game design plus narrative, and how it has evolved over the years. And I think you and Naughty Dog have really set the tone for how that can create a seamless
which is amazing.
experience.
It didn't feel like that when we were launching into it,
Well, I think a lot of people reference Uncharted as a series that did it extremely well. It was the first to really sort of create a lack of, I'll use the term, ludonarrative dissonance.
Yeah. There's plenty in there, but I can hear you.
Yeah. So was that a conscious decision on starting with Uncharted 1 to sort of become a representative of how it should be done, how design and narrative should intermesh more closely than previous games?
I don't know if we would have explicitly stated it that way, as that's our goal. I mean, how would you predict how successful it would be or how much it would be copied? Our goal, I mean, I even have, the original pitch documents. The goal was to basically say, we are creating an interactive homage, basically, to classic pulp adventure cinema. And so the idea is how do you take the structure, the common beats, the verbs, the sequences, all the kind of story beats that you find when it's like what events, what objectives, what sequences that you find in these films, and then how do you reconstruct that interactively as a game? And, we even said, like, the pitch documents, sort of like, all the, pulse pounding, two-fisted action, you know what I mean? Trying to put our little romantic spin on the whole thing. And so we were consciously going, and people have said, games shouldn't ape cinema. It's like, well, that was kind of the pitch, right? It's sort of like, we want to make a playable film. And that means getting all the story principles right. That means not, like, relegating story to a lesser importance than gameplay, not thinking of it as an afterthought, the fact that story is gameplay and gameplay is story, they influence each other, they are the same thing. So I guess the stated goal being, let's make this, a playable cinematic game. If we did it well, yes, I guess it was inevitable that it would influence people to go, oh, okay, so that's a thing, right? That's how we do that. I just think, when you're in the thick of it, you don't know if you're doing it well. And I don't think we even found our feet until Uncharted 2 anyway, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. When you look at today's games, like the big blockbuster games that are coming out for console and PC, where do you think they're doing well, and where do you think they're not doing well in terms of meshing narrative and design?
Well, look, there's still plenty of developers and publishers that still don't see story and writing as critical and as intrinsic as we see it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think some of that can be seen, like, the games that have been the most successful in this area, the creative director is like the writer, or if they have a writer, they are like arm in arm, right? Because the creative director has to be the kind of the constant nagging, like, defender of narrative. Because there's so many things that break it all the time, every day. And you have to be the person that goes, I know why you would love to do that, but it completely breaks the story, right? Or the person that goes, I see why you want to do that, and it's awesome, I'll go change my story. Right? Yeah. And being able to think holistically enough every day, every hour of every day, about all the knock-on effects of every decision that's getting made, how the game's coming together relative to the story, and how, kind of just adjusting those dials all the time, right? That doesn't work or happen if you're focused on gameplay and you bring an external writer to write some scenes. Yeah. Right? You end up with this disjointed thing, inevitably, right? Because they're just wired together, story and gameplay. Every layout decision you make, every mechanical decision you make affects whether the story rings true or not, or plays or not, or whether a scene is going to work. And because the nature of what we do is so iterative, like, you can't just write a script and then go shoot it. And a lot of people still think that you can do that. But I just don't think they can't be caring that much about story. Or they're looking at sort of the external trappings of doing a good story, which is, well, we hired a writer, we're shooting mocap, why is it not coming out, right? It's like, because you actually didn't, in your soul, do this the right way, which is, like, absolutely embedding story into gameplay and vice versa, right? So why, when people ask, like, what game are you the most proud of, the obvious answer would be something like Uncharted 2, but the answer I usually give is Soul Reaver, because I felt like, because we were starting from a blank slate, until we kind of had to turn it into a Legacy of Kain sequel. But at the very beginning there, it started from a purity of game design, meaning that there was nothing story-wise or mechanically that we were beholden to. We could just go, all right, so, just for example, it was the first sort of 3D platformer I'd ever worked on, right? That was crazy difficult to solve, right? Mm-hmm, yeah. And actually, I think it was cribbed from you guys, if I recall. Would the timing have worked out? But the gliding mechanic, right? When was the first?
Spyro. We had Spyro gliding in 1998.
Yes, I think I did steal it from you then. Yeah. Or at least I'd seen some early stuff. I don't know, right? Yeah. But we were all trying to solve that problem of, like, how do you stick a landing in a 3D platformer, right? You either do something deterministic and kind of land them on the platform that they sort of aimed at, which a lot of games did, right? Yeah. Even still do. Or you give them a way to sort of alter their descent. And you can do that in a way that's completely, like, abstract, like you would in a Mario game, where it's sort of like there is no reason you can kind of, like, air steer or anything like that. But But we didn't want to do that. And so we go, okay, so he's going to need to be able to glide, right? So that we can land on little platforms and pillars that are like a meter across. All right, why can he glide? What does that say about our character? Okay, well, maybe he's got wings. But if he had wings, he could fly. We don't want him to fly. Okay, well, maybe they're broken wings. Like, and the other starts, oh, well, how did he get broken wings, right? Like, so if you honor both gameplay and story and you let them yes and each other, it's another version of sort of, the improv between those two things, of plussing each other up, as opposed to going, who cares, fine, he just glides, what do we care? And that you let each of those decisions inspire the other, then you end up with this thing that actually is sort of like cohesive in its narrative and its gameplay design. So the idea of the spirit and physical world, which was obviously heavily cribbed from Legend of Zelda, the Light World and the Dark World, using that as part of our health system, looking at our health almost, even back then we were talking about sort of like Big Mario, Little Mario, and, like when you were in the physical realm, like obviously you had, health that you could lose. And then when you lost it all, then you would end up in the spirit realm and you knew that you were pretty screwed. And so don't die again or you're going to like get really dead and sent all the way back to the abyss. And the fact that he had to eat souls to survive, and so that gave us our motivation for our combat mechanics, and also built into our health system. But it was also his story, right? So that was really satisfying to be able to build something where it felt like, okay, so the internal logic is all kind of sound.
Yeah.
And you try to do the same thing with a game like Uncharted, right? But it's like immediately you're up against the fact of like, okay, well, I can't go. Well, I'd like him to glide. Right. So if you need a little bit of air steer, well, then you've got to put that in. Right. Or if you need some deterministic results for jumps and stuff like that, you put that in. So you already start having some restrictions about, real world rules and things like that.
I hope designers are listening to this because I think when we look ahead to where games can go and how we can take these just big, complicated pieces and make them resonate with fans, it does come down to justifying game mechanics with story and vice versa. I
think so. And look, there's plenty of experiences where it's sort of like story light or just sort of story silly, and that's fine because it doesn't really aspire to anything more, right? But it's funny, even those experiences that have started that way, now they're trying to figure out how they retrofit, like, now that their thing is taken off, whether it's Fortnite or PUBG or whatever, like, how do we actually retrofit story into this thing? Right?
Yeah, that's a great perspective. So, well, with that in mind, that seems to be game makers acknowledging that story is really important.
I think so. I mean, look, sometimes we dismiss it. And there's people that I think still would go, we shouldn't be talking about narrative and story. These are games. Why are we aping cinema? Why are we trying to like ape other media? We should be our own thing. And like, we abandon, the goals of the purity of game design at our peril. And I don't disagree with all of that in some ways, meaning, like, this is going to sound, I'm going to be a complete hypocrite and contradict myself all over the place here, but, like, I understand that. But I came to this whole thing as kind of a storyteller. That was actually my background, was in English lit and then filmmaking, and I just stumbled into this as an animator, then an artist, then a designer.
Were you doing animation for traditional films?
No, I was learning. I was trying to learn animation. I wasn't very good at like traditional hand-drawn animation. I was also learning on the Wavefront system. This is like 1988.
Yeah, probably. The predecessor of Maya, right? Wavefront, AIAS Wavefront became Maya eventually.
And it was before it was AIAS Wavefront. It was just Wavefront.
Wavefront, okay.
Right. And there was like this pilot program at San Francisco State where they had like, one seat of Wavefront and this giant like Silicon Graphics workstation.
Yeah.
And so there were like, I think maybe a half dozen of us that were in this program, and we sign up and go work on this thing and try to, figure out how to, actually do 3D stuff, back in the early days. And so that's where I was learning about all the principles of animation, but I was much better at it. I was much better at all of that stuff with the limitations of video games than I was if I would have had to use a pencil. So I'm just not that good of an artist, right? So it was more of a struggle for me. I could have gotten there if I really applied myself, I think. But like, so I had all the principles down, but then I could apply them to like doing stuff in AIAS later where like I understood, or doing it with pixels, where it's like, it's all about forcing this limited technology to do the thing that you want to do. And that was actually more fun to solve than having the wide open canvas of like, you're as good as your pencil. And I was like, I'm not very good at that, right? But I can make pixels do what I need them to do.
Yeah.
And I can, bend a skeleton inside of a model to make it do what it needs to do.
Well, that's a great point about constraints in general.
Yes.
Right? And so how do you, just making the jump here, how do you apply constraints in a way that doesn't feel constraining?
Well, it's going to sound sort of prosaic or whatever, but like just embrace them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all know that just having a completely blank slate can be pretty intimidating, right?
Absolutely.
Like,
it leads
paralysis,
to
right?
Chaos sometimes.
And it can, right? Especially if you want to be like inclusive in those early brainstorming days, you can really end up with a mess, right?
Yeah.
Because you end up being the villain who goes, those brainstorms were great. We're not using any of that because it was all nonsense. It was fun. Those were fun days. But I've always found that like when there aren't constraints applied, I will look for them because it gives me a scaffold or a shape to hang the thing on. And sometimes that's even just taking a stab at what you think the pillars of your thing are, right? So that you know what it isn't. And that even early days when you're just trying to think through things that, that gives you a pretty nice binary way of going, well, we're not going to do that because that wouldn't be important to this experience, right?
Yeah. Do you, when you are starting a new project, what is your approach to either creating constraints or setting a very early set of pillars? How do you practically do that with a giant project? What are the first few steps you take?
Well, my answer is probably going to be a little specific to the things that I've been doing for the last, 15 years or whatever, right? Which has been about deconstructing these other franchises or genres and figuring out what is the good interactive version of that. And so by definition, then you're looking at the thing, whether it's Indiana Jones or, Pulp Adventure or Star Wars, and going, all right, well, what are the requisite parts of this? Because that's going to tell me the things that I need to replicate, and it's going to tell me the things that really aren't that important and can go by the wayside. So it's slightly off topic, but I was saying earlier, to somebody, when we started off with Uncharted, obviously we knew that our main goal, put it in the kind of the concise paragraph, was to sort of homage these films, deconstruct them, reconstruct them, and take all of our tropes and gameplay verbs from these games that the movies that we deconstructed. One of which, of course, was this main character, right? We knew it wasn't going to be a woman because we didn't want to compete with Lara Croft. We were already getting called Dude Raider. We didn't want to tread any further into their territory. So who is this guy, right? And then you look at, why is Harrison Ford so appealing in every role? But certainly why was Indiana Jones so appealing? And it's because there's a hapless quality to him. The fact, again, that he's always at the edge of his ability. He doesn't sort of gracefully land a jump. He knocks the wind out of himself, and usually something else goes wrong. Think about when he's leaping the pit at the beginning of Raiders. He's always sort of sweaty and dirty and looks a little hurt all the time, and sort of caught out by people a lot. Whether it's he's just on his heels a lot, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we relate to him. If he was just sort of your sort of standard square-jawed hero, it wouldn't have caught, right? And actually, one of the differentiating factors for us thinking of constraints, not only was he needing to be male and not female because of Lara Croft, but Lara Croft back then was an aspirational figure. She was more like a James Bond. Before James Bond also got rebooted and became now kind of vulnerable, right? Because that's what we want these days. Yeah. But she was this aspirational figure who would stick every landing and was ready with, a very wry quip and worked alone and all these things. We were okay, companions, on his heels, male, so just because of needing to differentiate a practical goal, that created a whole bunch of identifying features, right?
Yeah.
And as soon as we said, okay, so we want this character to be relatable, not only did it help us with his design to go, well, he needs to be sort of unremarkable. And it doesn't seem it doesn't seem like a wild idea to us now, but the idea of creating a character in a t-shirt and jeans back then was just otherwise, again, unremarkable visually, was like, people did not know what to do with that, both in the press as well as internally with Sony marketing. I think all those people have changed now, so I can probably malign them. But yeah, I mean, we definitely had to do some convincing, or a matter of fact, not do convincing, just saying, you're going to have to trust us. You're going to have to trust us, right? That his humanity and vulnerability was going to come out of the fact that he's wearing cotton that wrinkles and, gets wet. And, and the fact that immediately we knew what all of our goals were with him, because it's like, well, if we're going to have a relatable character, he can't move like a traditional video game character. He needs to have little stumbles. You shouldn't be able to see the animation loop. The way his, arms flail should, not look like you're seeing the same animation all the time. If he's, throwing himself into cover, and there's a bullet ricocheting off the wall next to him, he should flinch and wince. It's like, so you're like, okay, so we need a really complex human locomotion system that looks natural, can work over like organic terrain, and has blended variability, blended in so that, he can stumble or flinch while playing another animation. Okay, we got a whole list of technical goals now, right? And so that's kind of just how you start. You identify the things that actually are like, okay, this is a key piece of our DNA. Now, therefore, what does that mean, right? And then as you start doing that, like I said, you start building the scaffolding of the thing until you go, okay, I know what we're building now, right? So it isn't just sort of one big stroke of genius that is on a piece of paper somewhere. It's sort of just breaking it down and embracing those few things where you go, okay, well, what are the constraints? So for instance, when I broke down the Star Wars stuff, and I've talked about this, so I don't think it's inappropriate to discuss, but like the process of breaking down Star Wars was very similar for me than breaking down like Indiana Jones and Pulp Adventure, right? They share a lot of DNA, those kinds of films. But what was the biggest difference with Star Wars for me? If you think about Indiana Jones, you never really cut away from him. And this is true of other movies of the type too. He's the protagonist. Yeah. There's other characters, but they are side characters, companions, whatever. You almost never cut away from him, right? And when you do, it's usually to inform something that he's doing. Mm-hmm. You don't cut away to sort of privileged, like you never cut away to the bad guys in an Indiana Jones film, right? Yeah. So Star Wars, you cut away to the bad guys all the time. So there's a privileged observer quantity to that I would have to go, okay, we're going to have to do that. That's going to affect how we're going to stream in that stuff. If we're cutting away, to an Imperial, Star Destroyer, like bridge, like, okay, that's not in memory, right? How are we going to deal with that? So it's like you start finding these really like meaty, like technical goals that you're going to have to solve right up front, because that no matter what, that's part of the end goal.
But also that's interesting because you made the decision to integrate existing DNA into your game because this is how Star Wars fans have been experiencing the franchise.
Well, if the goal again, and that's why I'm saying these examples, I'd have to go back to a Soul Reaver, I think. But if these examples for me are like saying, okay, well, I understand. I start with a constraint, which is I'm making an Indiana Jones, playable movie for all intents and purposes, or a Star Wars playable movie. What does that mean? If the goal is to have the player go, I feel like I experienced and played through one of those films. Yeah. Then right away we have a big laundry list of things that we need to do and get right. Because if you start extracting them, this doesn't smell right, but you don't know why. Maybe. Yeah. Like if it was structured. And so the two things that came out as we were studying Star Wars is one. This is true of most fiction, but it's like the characters are just constantly, outmatched, outgunned, outnumbered, right? And so they have to be pretty wily. And part of that wiliness is an improvisational quality, which if you think about all the things that, you would see these characters do, it's like they're constantly thinking of like clever ways to use the environment against their enemies or to their advantage. They're thinking about, how they can use disguise or deception or pull ruses, working together, things like that. It's usually not about taking the enemies head on at all, right? And so we admire them for their cleverness. And then on top of that, it's the fact that they're doing it together. None of these are lone wolf characters, right? We don't tend to see those in films anyway, right? That was something we needed to kind of get past in games to feel like we were telling stories that we were used to, which is about groups of characters and relationships. But Star Wars, more than anything, is about an ensemble, right? And that was the biggest difference for me when I was breaking it down, was going, oh, that's right. This is not about one character and their NPC friends. This is about an ensemble of characters that could be called co-protagonists. Because not only do they work together to solve problems, so it's Han, Luke, and Chewie going into the detention cells, right, to go rescue Leia. They also split off and do things. The only way they meet their goals is by working together and also working in parallel. So we would often point to the Death Star escape, in Episode 4. The idea that for them to escape the Death Star, it took, Obi-Wan getting the tractor beam down, it took the droids hacking into the computer systems, and it took Han, Luke, and Chewie to go into disguise, again using a ruse, and, break into the detention cells. And so the movie actually cut back and forth between them.
Yeah.
So immediately that tells us two things, right? All of this is like, okay, improvisational mechanics that we're going to actually encourage the player to be able to utilize. Really good partner AI, and then actually multiple playable characters. Because if you didn't cut back and forth between the characters in this ensemble, you would go, this doesn't feel like Star Wars, but I don't know why exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So then, boom, 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 we've got a bunch of technical goals we have to solve. Right? And you can go, okay, so that's a pillar of the experience. Anything that doesn't contribute to that or breaks that should go. Right? So
that's a great example.
Yeah.
For anybody who is, even if it's brand new IP.
Yeah, exactly.
Being able to establish
what's important, right?
Yeah. Think through those things. I think the tendency is not to, frankly.
I think so. And then you end up with something that ends up being kind of like a big sort of like accumulation of ideas as opposed to something that feels sort of intentional and curated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to switch just briefly to a couple really big topics and just overview. And so given that you are an industry veteran, you've seen it from different angles. You've been driving change in the industry through what you do. What are you most excited about as you look ahead to where you're going and where the industry is going over the next few years?
Well, it's funny. The thing that I'm investigating right now has gotten me excited in the past, really recently, because a lot of this wasn't very known to me more than a few months ago, is just the fact that it seems like, and look, I could be dead wrong, so I'm going to caveat this whole thing, but it seems like we are inevitably moving toward a future where content will be streaming right to us. You won't need a console, right? And if we just look at how this has evolved, we used to have CDs and, we go to Blockbuster to get movies or whatever. It's like the fact that music and TV and movies just stream directly to us at this amazing fidelity and with absolute seamlessness. Like, we couldn't have foreseen that not very long ago. So it feels inevitable to me, and we know that all these different companies are working on this, that we're going to have actual real-time content streaming right to our homes in the exact same way. That it won't be about console wars and a console future. It's going to just come to your television, right? And that says to me then, inevitably, unless we then put a wall up around those platforms, the streaming platforms, as just another console, it's just virtual. If it's actually going to stream like a Trojan horse right to people's televisions who don't consider themselves gamers, we have an opportunity to actually reach a whole lot of people, a much bigger audience with interactive content. And I think it's going to be critical that it's narrative content for this audience, in the same way that, a show can reach them on Netflix, an interactive experience can be reaching them. We just have to make it frictionless for them to be wanting to try it out because they don't see themselves as gamers. But I think we're all inclined to play. And I think we're all inclined to seek story out and to gravitate toward well-told stories and engaging characters. So it seems crazy that we're not considering how we're going to create content that is actually accessible to that audience. So I would love to solve that problem if I'm calling the future right, meaning that if it's inevitable that in somewhere between 2 to 5 years, maybe longer, but in the ballpark, that this will be as true as streaming video and streaming music. That's not a lot of time to get something created. As we know, these games take years to make now, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's a version of what we've done? Like, what's a version of Uncharted or a Star Wars or whatever that is already following familiar story structure rules and pacing? So it won't be, content-wise, it wouldn't be unfamiliar to this audience. But in terms of intimidation, in terms of what that interactive experience, you can see I'm trying to avoid the word game in some ways, right? Because it comes with certain expectations that I think semantically we might want to get away from.
Yeah.
What is an interactive experience? What's a narrative interactive experience for them? And I don't think it has to be like an us and them. I think it can be all inclusive, but it does raise some big, tricky questions around, well, what are those obstacles for a larger audience that doesn't consider themselves gamers and is intimidated by consoles and DualShock controllers and the complexity?
How do we think we find that out?
I think we just have to make some stuff. And we have to make good stuff because, again, if you make something crappy and you don't actually attract an audience because of its crappiness, then you didn't get an answer about whether people are interested in interactivity. Because some would say there's a different audience. There's a passive viewing audience, and then there's people that seek out games. And I'm just like, I don't know, because it's that big number change, the difference in the number between people that are actually like core gamers and people that are like, people say, well, no, there's 2.5 billion gamers in the world because they're counting all the people playing on their tablets and stuff, which they should, right? They're playing games, they're gamers. They don't want to be called that, and I've sort of said I don't think we should try to like rehabilitate that word in their minds, because I think we're talking about something else.
Yeah.
Because if game implies difficulty, challenge, failure, competition, mastery, right? Is there something else we can make that, if those are obstacles and intimidating factors for an audience that wants to have an interactive experience but doesn't want to feel the pressure, is intimidated by all of that, or off-put by it in some way, can we take what we know how to do and create interactive experiences for this audience that also appeal to us, but are shifting away from this idea of game as something to be beat, right? It was Gary Whitta that said this to me, I think, that it's hilarious that we talk about beating games, but we don't talk about beating movies and beating books and we just have a different relationship with this content, but that means we're leaving this big gap between linear media and games, where we could have all kinds of interesting, moving, interactive content for an audience that right now it's completely, there is stuff out there they could play, but it's not discoverable to them.
Yeah.
Or because it's sitting on a console that intimidates them, or we're just not very good at exposing this stuff to them. That's why I was using Florence as an example and praising it, Like, here's a game that is completely linear, right? Your experience, on paper, step by step, is no different than mine. You go through each of the beats of the story. But your internalized experience of playing through Florence's story with those tactile mechanics is going to be different than mine, because you're going to bring something different to it. And, the fact that I'm the one trying to put the pieces together, for an argument, or pull the pieces together of the torn photograph as they drift apart, and how that affects me emotionally, and how the tactile experience of those mechanics informs the story in a way that linear or like passive media could never do. There's something there, but we're not making that stuff, enough of that stuff, for an audience that I think would be actually welcoming and moved by it, and we're not making it discoverable. So what's a version of the kind of games that we do that is actually succeeding at the kind of things that Florence does, right?
Yep.
Look, Firewatch did the same thing.
Yeah.
Like Edith Finch did the same thing. Simplified mechanics and stories that people can feel, right? But it requires a lot of thinking around what is that frictionless future. It's got to be a subscription service to, real-time content So it can't just be a game service because they won't buy that, right? So it's got to be a subscription service that sort of Trojan horses it to them. It can't be on a traditional controller. I think we have to we're relying on the smartphones we have in our pockets as it's an analog controller. And everyone has one and knows how to use it, and have that speak to the game. And I think we have to get over the fact that games necessarily must be about mastery and difficulty and competition, and even like give up on the idea of fail states. And that seems just like heretical, right? I feel like I'm gonna lose all of my game design cred or gamer cred, but like I just keep feeling like there's this huge void between people that don't think this is for them, but they don't know what they're missing.
Yeah.
Because we're not making things that are accessible to them. And the irony for me is we're moving in the game industry farther away from what's accessible. And it's not that I don't appreciate or respect or admire games like Spider-Man and God of War and Red Dead, but they're exhausting, right? They're too big, right? So even people like me and a lot of my sort of fellow gamers that, have been doing this for a while and still consider ourselves gamers, there's something a little exhausting about sitting down to play these games because they're long. I know I'll probably never see the end, and I play them for story. That's my main motivation. I know there's going to be sub-screens with, skill trees, and there's side missions and maps, and you just kind of go, oh, God. And then I'll go play something like Obra Dinn, Return of the Obra Dinn, and I am in heaven.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't think I'm not a gamer anymore. I just think that, a lot of the games, so obviously we know that everybody's trying to crack this games as a service, live service, battle royale problem. Everybody would love to have these games that sort of never end.
Sure.
And are kind of, monetizable, ongoing. I get it. I get the business, rationale for that. It's not a great place to tell a story, right? And then even the pressure to go, like Uncharted was 8 hours long maybe, right? What games are like that? Mainstream games are like that anymore. No. And no second mode and no multiplayer and no online, right? You just can't. You just got to keep layering on features so that there's sort of like value and perceived value and all these things. But at the same time, we also have this, game industry wisdom that most people will never finish your game.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have stats on how many people finish Spider-Man. And that's not, that's not as intimidating as some others, right?
Yeah. But I think you raised a really good challenge, and this is an opportunity for people who are thinking ahead to what they're going to be making next, and how to. We're always sort of asking ourselves, how do we broaden our audience? And you just created, I think, from what you said, sort of an opportunity to establish a new genre. It's a narrative. It's a much more accessible, narrative-driven game that is not as focused on hardcore mechanics.
Right.
And accessibility is king in that, right? So
now look, the person closest to doing this is David Cage in Quantic Dream, right? And he's been trying to solve this, game by game for a long time now.
And the audience hasn't been there, right? I mean, not to the extent that streaming could bring an audience for games of that ilk, or games that have sort of this, maybe they aren't like the Quantic Dreams games, but they are similar in their accessibility. Sure.
Yeah. I think it's taking a lot of the lessons that we've learned making games like Uncharted and going, okay, well, what's the version of that is simplified? I won't say dumbed down, right? But I mean, accessible and simplified in a way that it still gives you that tactile experience, and this, the wish fulfillment and the analog experience of being this character in a world, but without all the sort of the punishing qualities.
Yeah. And I think, and I'll just interject, I think one of the things that helps separate games from traditional content, passive content, is an effective game loop that keeps you coming back, right? And that's tuning that game loop where there's just enough of a challenge where it feels good.
Right.
You've accomplished something. It's like hitting that great golf swing.
And that's our craft, which is why even talking like this, I feel like a bad game designer. But I can't ignore the fact that it seems like... So part of where this comes from for me, as I'm sort of looking at the landscape and thinking about my options and what I want to do, is I keep coming back to this phenomenon that we saw with Uncharted, And then we've seen with some other games like Until Dawn, they had the same thing where the games were just as watchable as they were playable.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about like Twitch stream or, let's play video kind of watchable. People's families and spouses and significant others were all like, don't you dare play that without me.
Yeah.
We're going to pick that. You stop right here. We're going to pick that up, tomorrow or whatever. And they weren't just because they were like, I want to see the next cutscene. They were engaged. They were like collaboratively playing the game without a controller in their hand, right? They were saying, wait, look over there. I think I saw something. They were helping look for treasures. They were helping solve puzzles. They were enjoying the cinematic unfolding of the story and vocally collaborating.
Yeah.
With the people in the room. Now, you have to have the right genre for that. It has to lend itself to it. That's why Until Dawn, I think, was so great, too, because it's like it leans right into that. You watch horror films together and, and kind of shout at the screen. But people that are in, like, the TV and film industry haven't seen that phenomenon. Yeah. Only we saw that.
Yeah.
So they don't know how to leverage that or how to make that. And so it's like, because I look at that and go, if they were so engaged, and we heard that over and over and over, why aren't we making this stuff intentionally? That it's a shared experience. And it can be kind of a collaborative experience, even if one person is the main performer, or they pass the controller around, or whatever, or we make it accessible by using phones. And better yet, why are we not making content that those people actually want to pick up the controller and say, well, I want to try that. I'm not scared, right?
But I think we can. I mean, that's what's wonderful now. And there are enough, and given how much the industry continues to bring in new developers, right, with new voices, this is the kind of thing that people need to hear. I mean, this is the kind, I think, in a way you're softly throwing down the gauntlet and saying, look, let's think more broadly. Let's break out of our traditional approach to design and narrative. And
that's why, I want to be careful about language I use, because I don't want it to sound like I'm at all like saying we're doing anything wrong. I just think we're leaving money on the table, I think, but also we're just leaving this large audience unserved and going, oh, well, they're not gamers. It's like, are they not?
Right.
Like, isn't that kind of a shitty attitude if we kind of like close the doors and go, well, we're gamers and there's people that aren't real gamers, right? It's like, why aren't we giving them something more than match 3 to play, And I think, again, just based on this anecdotal experience that we had of this phenomenon, if you make the right kind of content and you make it as good as a TV show or a movie and you make it interactive, they spark on that and go like, oh, that's a thing. And I think about all the hard-won tricks that we have learned in making games like this would be a revelation to these people.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they have no idea what we can do. And I keep running into that, even just trying to think about how to like pitch this idea of, virtual production and real-time content creation, even for like linear media, how to use game engines to create, very watchable content. There's a big misunderstanding, I think, in Hollywood about how we do what we do.
Yeah.
Like, and, and sometimes you have to overcome a certain amount of like organizational or, institutional arrogance around it of like, okay, we know linear media, we'll tell you how this stuff works. And it's like, well, actually, I think we got this, and that our understanding of how you do real-time content production and the benefits of that and the liberating qualities of it, and now how the fidelity, how watchable it is, how smooth it all is, like, part of that was one of the barriers too. People didn't want to like sit and look at you play a game because it didn't look very good, right? Now it's like watching a show, or it can be an interactive show. So things that are old hat to us and that we're jaded about, I think, like I said, would be kind of revelatory for this new audience. So the question is who's really going to be there? Who's going to have the right platform? How long is this really going to take? It's not going to be cheap, right? So somebody's going to have the courage and the will and the dollars to go, yeah, let's try this out. How do you try that out? Do you do it something small and bite-sized first? Where does that show up? Like, these are all rhetorical questions, I guess, because, so that's the world I'm living in right now.
And they'll be answered. And that's what's exciting about the next few years.
I think so.
They will be answered, or at least people will be trying to answer them, and we'll all learn a lot on the way.
Or we'll discover that these people do not actually want interactive entertainment. And we go, okay, got it.
Oh, but I hope that's not the case.
I think that's the case, I just feel like, that's why I was dying to see how the Bandersnatch thing on Netflix would work out. I haven't really heard any numbers or any real what their impressions are of how successful that was. But again, I don't know. I think I would take them with a little grain of salt because again, I think it's antithetical to what we're talking about. We're talking about an analog experience that you get to kind of set the pace as opposed to one that is largely passive with brief moments of actually, binary choice that affect the very thing that we want to be crafted and authored for us, the story, right?
I'm nodding enthusiastically.
Yes.
Even though nobody on
I don't want anybody to think I'm criticizing Bandersnatch because I think it's actually really clever for what it is. But I worry that people look at it and go, aha, so interactive television.
No,
it's
I think
but no. Yeah.
Yeah, what's great is that you're highlighting all of the challenges that still exist, right? Mm-hmm. And it's great that that's a sort of an attempt to move in the more interactive direction, but we have great solutions in this industry and we should employ them. Right.
And it's the inverse of that, meaning that it's like you are actively, to what we found anyway, you are actively sort of playing in this what we would always call this wide linear space, right? Where we give you some freedom, same sort of more freedom than you would have in a game like Florence, where it's sort of like, you getting to point A to point B doesn't change point B, but you kind of put your own spin on it and you experience through play. Right?
Yeah.
And then you get to this very carefully and intentionally crafted story moment that you want to be part of this arc of very intentionally crafted story moments that are setups and payoffs and reversals. So, of course, you're leaning in and watching these things, and then back to the interactive part, which is the reverse of a Bandersnatch, right? Yeah.
Amy, this has been fantastic. Thank you for sharing so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's fun.
It is. This is the kind of conversation that we should be having across the industry all the time. And I really thank you for sharing your expertise and your thoughts about the future as well.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Cool.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.